Hello, my friends. Wishing all of you great health. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with the truth. Today, we have a very special piece of news. Let's get started. A lot of people talk about Russophobia as if it suddenly appeared today or as if it started in the Cold War. I don't buy that. If you look honestly across the last century and more, you can see that Western suspicion of Russia has older roots. You can even trace it back to the period of the Russian Revolution, when Western states, the UK in particular, led a joint intervention to stop the Bolsheviks from consolidating power in Moscow. So when did the modern anti-Russia paranoia really begin? Let me give you a historical answer, because the record is more complicated than propaganda slogans. What comes to my mind first is that I live in France, and I've recently reread descriptions of how the French greeted the Russians when Tsar Alexander III came to France. That visit marked the beginning of the Franco-Russian alliance. One of the most beautiful bridges in Paris is the Pont Alexandre III, right across from the Place de la Concorde. And the tone in France at that time was that Russia was the best thing that could happen to France. There were public eulogies to Nicholas II, to Russia, to Russian culture. There was genuine cultural enrichment going both ways, even as late as the 1990 seconds. When I was traveling to France regularly, French public television and France Culture aired recurring segments on Russian culture. You'd hear about Bulat, Okudzova, Mayakovsky, Russian literature, Russian music as a normal staple. I could never imagine turning on a mainstream American cultural program and hearing that kind of sustained, respectful engagement with Russian civilization. Back then, ordinary French people were friendly to Russians in a way that's hard to describe today. So if we're going to talk about the origins of current Russophobia, we need to separate long-term historical patterns from short-term political triggers. In the short term, there are two clear sources. First, remember that when Vladimir Putin became president, nearly every Western leader called him a friend. There was real warmth between Putin and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. George W. Bush talked about Putin as a personal friend. Italy, France, Spain, the same story. Western capitals regarded Russia as a partner, and they believed cooperation with Moscow was natural and beneficial. So what changed? Two things changed the climate dramatically. One was the influence of the Baltic states and Poland inside the broader European Union. The other was the shift in Washington after 2003. Start with the big European powers, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, to some extent even Britain. They discovered they had a lot in common with Russia. They benefited from investment ties, from tourism, from long-standing cultural familiarity. Russia was pumping money into Southern Europe. Spain alone saw massive Russian tourism and capital flows. There were old cultural ties, and there was also a shared instinct in Europe to resist American overreach. That mattered. Look at what happened when the United States launched the Iraq War. Three countries stood up together in joint opposition: France, Germany, and Russia. That alignment was a nightmare for Washington. From the American establishment's viewpoint, the French, the Germans, and the Russians looked like the core of Europe, a potential bloc that could resist U.S. strategy. On top of that, the Germans were buying Russian gas, and the two economies were becoming mutually interdependent. The panic in Washington was simple: we're losing Europe. And out of that panic came decisions to expand NATO, to block strategic cooperation between Russia and Germany, and to harden an anti-Russian posture that became visible from 2003 onward. I was not in the room when those decisions were made, but the results are obvious if you track policy and messaging after that year. The second short-term source is the Baltics and Poland. They experienced occupation and Stalinist terror, and that trauma is real. But here's what I always say to Baltic and Ukrainian colleagues who frame those crimes as Russian crimes. The horrors of the 1,930 seconds were not committed by Russians as an ethnicity. They were committed by Bolsheviks, by a communist system operating on a class war theory. That system targeted anyone it labeled bourgeois: landowners, policemen, clergy, professionals, peasants who resisted collectivization. Russia itself suffered more from Bolshevism than any other nation. In 1932 alone, About 4 million Russian peasants, not distinguished from Ukrainians by ethnicity, but labeled kulaks by class, were deported to Siberia to die because they resisted collectivized farming. Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians suffered deportations for the same reason: class categorization by an ideological state, not ethnic hatred from ordinary Russians. The Bolsheviks did the same to Russian capitalists and Russian ruling classes. They exterminated them during the Civil War and through terror. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, many in Eastern Europe interpreted Bolshevik terror simply as Russia, and they carried that grudge into EU institutions. That attitude was then amplified by Washington's anti-Russian shift. Those two streams fused into the modern political climate we're living through now. There was also anti-Bolshevik resentment in France after World War I because the Bolsheviks confiscated French assets and refused to honor Tsarist debts. France lost a lot of money, so yes, the political class was angry, but even that didn't produce a lasting cultural hatred of Russia. 2 million Russian officers migrated to France. They became keepers of Russian culture, integrated into French intellectual life, and actually deepened Franco-Russian cultural closeness. Even during the Cold War, French leaders like de Gaulle spoke of the Soviet Union with a certain strategic respect. Brezhnev was welcomed in Paris. De Gaulle visited Moscow. If you want to understand today, you can't pretend there was some unbroken historical line of European hatred toward Russia. That's just false. Now, another piece of the puzzle is what happened after 9/11. It's almost erased from Western memory. But Russia was the first major country to offer real help to the U.S. after the attacks, not symbolic help, real help. Putin and the Russian establishment in the late 1992 and early 2000s were broadly pro-Western. There were American advisors around Yeltsin. Western investment was encouraged. Russia wanted stability after the chaos of the 1992, and cooperation with the West was part of rebuilding the state. So in 2001, Moscow gave Washington diplomatic cover, intelligence cooperation, and even permission for U.S. forces to use air bases in Central Asia to strike targets in Afghanistan. Russia viewed Afghanistan as a hub for anti-American terrorism, too. That was a genuine partnership gesture. So how did we go from that moment to open hostility? It didn't stop in Afghanistan. Washington reinterpreted 9/11 as a license for total strategic control over the Middle East, culminating in Iraq. Russia, France, and Germany said, no, you're going too far. The streets of Europe in 2003 were intensely anti-American, and European governments reflected that mood. A U.S. invasion of Iraq without a Security Council resolution was illegal under international law, and Europe, alongside Russia, understood that clearly. That split, once it happened, never really healed. Fast forward to today and look at Russia's position. Hundreds of billions in Russian assets have been seized or frozen in the West. Russia has been pushed out of Western financial and trade systems. It's natural to ask whether Moscow will ever again participate in that Western economic order the old way, or whether it will look elsewhere, to the global South, to the East, and to partners who don't treat Russia as a permanent enemy. In my view, Russia already has answered that question. It has other options, and it has learned the hard way that dependence on Wall Street or the City of London is not security, it's vulnerability. There are two sides to Russia's break with Europe. First, there is a political, cultural, economic, even military rupture, and it's profound. For the first time in 400 or 500 years, Russia no longer wants to be like the West. That is historic. Ever since the mid-1600s, Russia pursued Westernization. St. Petersburg itself, my home city, was built as a symbol of that European orientation. But that chapter is closing. And it's not just because of the Ukraine war. It's deeper than that. What thinkers like Alexander Dugin argue, and what French historian Emmanuel Todd has also been saying in his own way, is that the West has been moving into a post-Christian, post-traditional identity project that many conservative societies find unacceptable. The celebration of godlessness, radical identity politics, and a cultural revolution against religion has alienated not just Russia, but much of the non-Western world. Orthodox Christianity is central to Russian identity in ways Western elites often refuse to understand. And Russia is not alone in this cultural pushback. Many Islamic societies, as well as India and even parts of China, see the same Western trajectory as hostile to their civilizational foundations. So the cultural break was already forming. The war simply accelerated it. Second, there is the geopolitical issue that Europeans prefer to describe as Russian imperialism, but Russians experience is something far more basic. For most Russians, and I mean the overwhelming majority, Ukraine is historically and civilizationally intertwined with Russia. Kiev is where Russian statehood began. Russians see Ukrainians as a closely related people with a shared origin and deep ties. The difference between Russians and Ukrainians, in that view, is closer to regional variation than to an absolute civilizational boundary. So when NATO and the EU expanded toward what Russians view as their own historical space, and when the 2014 Maidan upheaval brought openly nationalist anti-Russian forces to power in Kiev, Moscow concluded it could not accept a strategic takeover of Ukraine by Western blocs. Whatever you think of the conflict, you can't understand Russia's resolve unless you grasp that perception. The Poles and the Baltic states pushed their long Soviet-era resentments into EU policy. The Bandera tradition in Ukrainian nationalism reinforced those attitudes, and the whole thing merged into a single stream. Anti-Russian hysteria, pro-NATO expansion, and EU growth at Russia's expense. Russia said no, and it meant it. Inside Russia today, you can see several trends at once. There's a renewed interest in Soviet symbolism, especially Stalin, more as a symbol of order and victory than as a blueprint for policy. There's a revival of monarchist sympathies and historical pride in the imperial era. There's also a deep return to Orthodox roots. And on top of all that, you have a forward-looking Russian state vision that tries to blend tradition, sovereignty, and modern technology into a single national project. Those streams don't always align neatly, but together they express something important. Russia is rebuilding a post-Western identity. And even the most orthodox, even the most monarchist segments of society groups that historically had cultural ties to Europe now see the West as hostile to Russia's survival. At the same time, it would be wrong to claim that every Russian cultural tie to Europe has vanished. Culturally, Russia remains European in literature, art, and intellectual temperament. Many educated Russians still follow European culture closely, and some still hope for reconciliation one day. I don't exclude that possibility either. But Russia will never again treat Europe as its only horizon. The priority now is Asia. Why? Because the longest border Russia has is with China. Because the biggest growth partners are China, India, and the wider BRICS world. And because for the first time in history, there is nothing Russia needs that it cannot obtain from the East, whether in trade, technology, or industrial scale. China is building high-tech capacity, robotics, chips, and infrastructure at world-leading levels. India is rising fast. A non-Western payment system is no longer a fantasy. It's a rational hedge against Western political weaponization of finance, so the pivot to Asia is long-term and serious. Russia is becoming more integrated into Eurasia in the global south, not as a junior partner, but as a sovereign pole in a multipolar world. Europe, meanwhile, is fracturing internally. Southern Europe is not instinctively anti-Russian. Parties like Marine Le Pen's in France or Alternative for Deutschland in Germany are not driven by Russophobia. Hungary is openly pragmatic toward Moscow. Italians and Greeks have never shared Northern Europe's obsession with antagonizing Russia. The real hardliners are in the north, Britain, Scandinavia, and now Finland and Sweden, and that reflects their own historical patterns. The EU's future is far from stable. There may be a rebellion against centralization in Brussels, against Ursula von der Leyen's policies, and against the structural contradictions of the euro itself. Todd argues that a currency without unified fiscal policy creates moral hazard and debt spirals, and you can see that in France, Italy, and across the continent. If the EU, in its current anti-Russian form, fractures or reforms, normal neighborly ties between Russia and Western Europe may eventually return. But even if they do, they won't be Russia's priority the way they were for centuries. The center of gravity has shifted eastward. That's where we are. If you approach this with history instead of slogans, you see a Russia that tried partnership, was met with containment, and has now chosen sovereignty. You see a Europe being pulled in two directions, and an American establishment that still can't tolerate an independent Eurasian balance. And you see why Moscow believes it has no choice but to stand firm. That's the reality shaping the world we're living in, and it's not going away. Diplomacy is all over the place. The S has proposed a peace framework to Ukraine, and we need to talk about the real meaning of that proposal, not the opium, idealistic, emotional narratives floating around online. There's a lot of emotion tied up in this war, and I get it, but realists have to stay grounded. What's making this even worse is that many people in the West have tied their identity, credibility, even their careers to a maximalist Ukrainian victory, total rollback to the 1991. Borders, Crimea included, the whole wish list. That's not analysis. That's religion. And when reality collides with religion, reality wins. We also need to look one step further. What happens if Zelensky accepts a deal? Anyone not burying their head in the sand knows Ukraine has strong nationalist currents, including heavily armed formations. If a deal is accepted, what happens internally? When borders reopen, do the men leave en masse? Do women and children return? What happens to the economy? What happens to security? We'll walk through that because those second-order effects are enormous. Then we'll move into the maps. I've got a lot of geolocations from reliable sources. Our order is Pokrovsk, Myrnorad sector first, then the Severodonetsk-Lyman axis, then broader maps. So let's get into it. Here's Ukraine center screen. Kyiv is the capital. Red indicates territory. Russia currently occupies around 22%. Purple is territory held since 2014. And you can see the red check marks on the Ukrainian map confirmed Russian gains. I always use that as my threshold. Confirmation by the opposing side is the strongest validation you can get. If Ukraine were advancing, we'd use the same standard in reverse. First up, Pokrovsk. This is deep state mapping down here. We can see Russian pressure north of Myrnorad and toward the Krasny-Lyman direction. But what really shocked me today, and I triple-checked dates because I didn't want to be wrong, is the Ukrainian General Staff map as of November 22. Their depiction of the Pokrovsk-Myrnorad situation is significantly behind reality. It's even further off than the worst COPE mappers out there. If this is just propaganda, fine, it's still reckless. But I hope to God the General Staff isn't relying on that for real operational awareness, and I hope soldiers aren't using it on their phones, because you'd be engaged by Russian forces 10 kilometers before you even think you're near contact. Unbelievable. But let's look at what's actually happening. There's a lot of gray zone here. And remember, gray zone isn't a magic 50/50 contested sticker. It's a spectrum. In this sector, much of the gray zone is 80-90% controlled by Russian forces. Ukrainians hold sporadic pockets, mostly on the northern outskirts. I've said before, it would be useful if these maps added a heat gradient to show degree of control, but they don't, so you need to read it properly. Now look at Syriac's plotting and Mr. Syriac's updates. Russian movement west to east, pushing toward Myrnorad down the main road. The gray zone is shifting northwest of Pokrovsk, and what used to be a pinch has turned into a tunnel, an exit entry corridor that's getting narrowed fast. A geolocation today should have everyone concerned. I can't show the clip, but it's a Ukrainian drone strike on Russian forces. The geolock puts that contact here in these buildings directly west of central Myrnorad. If that area is gray zone, and it is, then you're talking about a line of separation of roughly 960 meters from the Russian forward edge to the core of the city, and operationally the sector is already encircled. It's cut off vertically by Russian artillery, drones, FAB, glide bombs, a classic vertical envelopment. This has gone from critical to catastrophic at the worst possible time because Ukraine is also dealing with systemic corruption, massive desertion, AWOL rates, and collapsing morale. And with Washington now signaling it wants out, the timing could not be uglier for Kyiv. Let's shift north to a front that hadn't moved for years but is moving quickly now, the Severodonetsk-Lyman axis. This line, if fought to conclusion, inevitably points toward Sloviansk-Kramatorsk. So we need to watch it. On the northern side, there's movement around Zakitny, slightly west of the Yampil sector. Remember, we said earlier that Yampil had come under Russian control. That's holding additional pressure showing around the Dronivka direction and edging toward Lyman itself. My guy on the ground said there have been Russian forces in central Lyman for weeks, and today's mapping is aligning with that. Southern side, we've got the Zelenivka front, Russian thrusts into southern Seversk and east to west pressure consolidation. AMK corrected some earlier assumptions and now says there's more Russian control south of this line than he initially realized. Now to the geolocations I collected today. Not my geos, but the most reliable ones in circulation. First, a Russian flag raising point, about 35 kilometers behind the front line north of Zelenivka. That suggests Russian forces are not just probing, but building depth. We saw yesterday geos reaching 9 kilometers back, today up to 6 kilometers. That's acceleration. Second, a small unnamed village across this river, labeling on the map, is off. We see a Russian UGV overturned, a Russian quad bike, and Russian troops engaged and targeted in this area. The footage suggests successful engagement, but even when a strike lands, the key point is the location. This sits about 4 kilometers behind the updated front edge after crossing forest and water obstacles. That is not noise. That is penetration. Then we move up toward the Torsk-Borivsky-Rivki pocket, a pocket within a pocket, what we sometimes call Surskai's cargo shorts. Suryak shows a northwestern push tightening the pocket between the Oskil River and Russian positions. AMK mirrors a western push consistent with Deep State's depiction. The geolock shows a Russian squad-sized, about 8-men section attack into these buildings with movement into the structure line. People will scream meat wave. Call it that if you want. What matters is it's working in terrain where Ukraine has limited support options because they're squeezed between Russian axes and the Oskil. This pocket can collapse faster than people expect. All right, that's the battlefield snapshot. Now let's talk politics, specifically the U.S. peace plan. Someone behind the scenes flagged something important: Zelensky's repeated use of dignified peace. That phrase isn't random. The Maidan upheaval is often called the revolution of dignity. The word dignity appears again and again in Zelensky's speeches. So the question is he signaling that accepting the U.S. plan would betray Maidan, subtly urging Ukrainians to reject the deal and fight on? Or is he trying to legitimize the deal by linking it to Maidan's legacy? I'm still 50/50. Zelensky might not even know his final position. He may be floating ambiguity to see how the public reacts, then aligning with the most survivable political line. That's classic trial balloon behavior, like anonymous NYT leaks designed to test sentiment without committing. But the deeper issue, and I can't stress this enough, is what happens inside Ukraine if a deal is accepted. You'll have armed people who have sacrificed everything, told for years they'd get all borders back, NATO membership, EU membership, war crimes tribunals, the whole show. If the signature locks in the battlefield reality instead, many will feel they could have gotten a better deal years ago without this level of bloodshed. That internal backlash risk is huge. We could see an inward turn on Kyiv. People don't like to talk about the nationalist factor, but it is there, it is armed, and it is volatile. Now let's look at what J.D. Vance has said. He frames the peace approach as needing to stop the killing while preserving Ukrainian sovereignty, be acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine, maximize the chance the war doesn't restart. Here's the blunt realist part. If NATO membership remains on the table, the war continues, period. Russia went into this conflict to prevent NATO absorption of Ukraine. That strategic driver did not vanish. But I still think the framework is more acceptable to Russia than people admit, not because it gives Russia everything it wants, but because it reflects the battlefield facts. The critics either misunderstand the framework or lie about ground reality. There's still a fantasy that more money, more weapons, more sanctions equals victory. It doesn't. Manpower is the core problem, and the loudest online cheerleaders calling for escalation aren't volunteering to fight. They're monetizing outrage while pretending to be strategists. Smooth brain activity, but profitable. Vance also pointed to Niall Ferguson's threat. I don't agree with Ferguson on everything, but he's grappling with reality in a way most critics refuse to do. The core idea is simple: the best is the enemy of the good. Wars end by victory or compromise, not by op-eds. The 28-point draft is a basis for negotiation, not a utopia. It affirms Ukrainian sovereignty, envisions security guarantees, reconstruction. Yes, territorial terms and amnesty are hard to swallow, but if you want every border back and Putin in The Hague, you have to win militarily, and Ukraine has never been in a position to defeat Russia. It could delay, it could frustrate, it could inflict costs, and it did. But defeating Russia outright? No. Trump is taking risk by pushing this. Prolonging the war another year is not in Ukraine's interest. The battlefield is deteriorating quickly. Even if recruitment somehow surged today, those men won't stabilize the front for a year. Energy, industry, morale, all deteriorating. If Russia reaches the Dnipro or Zaporizhia city and you try to renegotiate, then you might be staring at a one-point plan, unconditional surrender. That's how brutal this can get. This intersects with what Big Serge wrote months ago, and I still think it's one of the most important realist essays on this war. Negotiations don't create outcomes. They codify battlefield outcomes. The sword carves the map, the pen signs off what already exists. That's classic Realpolitik. Russia understands that, and Moscow believes it's on a trajectory for substantially more gains in the next 6-12 months. Frankly, that's why Russia is willing to entertain a peace draft at all, because if Ukraine and Europe reject it, Russia can finish faster once U.S. support falls away. And to people saying U.S. support doesn't matter much, you're wrong massively. American ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting data, satellite coverage, Patriots, HIMARS, spare parts, logistics pipelines, and especially Starlink cannot be backfilled by Europe. Not soon, not close. Lose U.S., ISR, and Starlink, and Ukraine's operational coherence collapses. So if Washington pulls out, Russia doesn't need 12, 18 months. It may need 3, 6. That's the harsh significance of this moment. AMK says Russia is winning the war, so negotiations will favor Russia. That's not a spicy take. That's how war works. If Ukraine were winning, negotiations would favor Kyiv. That's why Europe keeps talking about putting Ukraine in the best position. It's a political attempt to alter negotiation leverage, but they can't change the battlefield with slogans. War is not Hollywood. In attrition warfare, the stronger side wins. Russia's the stronger side. Recruitment, artillery, air power, logistics depth, strategic patience, and now the global reorientation that reduces sanction leverage. That's the reality. Linear warfare bros keep saying Russia only took X kilometers per month, so it will take 200 years to reach Kyiv. Reality already disproved that. Momentum compounds, pressure builds, fortifications crack. Advance rates can change quickly. Bankruptcy theory applies. You go broke slowly, then all at once. And the same happens to a collapsing front. Calling the U.S. proposal unacceptable is delusional. It's the first plan we've seen that actually reflects the battlefield situation. It still paints a relatively rosy picture compared to what's likely coming. Ukraine is bleeding irreplaceable manpower. Russia is taking losses, yes, but replacing them mostly with volunteers. The West is running out of patience and leverage. Sanction package number 20 won't change the basic math. So here's the cold realist framing. The plan offers Kyiv a path to state survival, not victory. And survival of the people should come before redrawing borders. The loudest pro-Ukraine activists treat survival as surrender because they're insulated from the costs. They demand maximalism while expecting others to die for it. Victory is not a function of donations and hashtags. It's a function of manpower, economy, and operational capacity. Ukraine is short on all three. Washington wants this war closed because the strategic contest is China. Donbass is not a vital U.S. interest. Russia is a strategic balancer in the Eurasian game. That's why the U.S. is leaning toward closure now. Again, realism, not ideology. Negotiations formalize outcomes. They don't create them. The sword predates and transcends the pen. A peace deal today would be imperfect and unfair because the battlefield is unfair. But bitter outcomes are still outcomes. And the alternative is not victory. The alternative is collapse and a settlement dictated entirely by Russia. That's why I keep saying, accept a painful compromise now or let the war run and watch the collapse unfold in real time. Reality doesn't care about anyone's feelings. It only cares about who can still fight. Now, let's finish by checking the broader map movements. Start north. There has been sizable Russian ground gain between Avdiivka adjacent sectors, roughly 7 kilometers across and nearly 3 kilometers deep. Not brand new territory in my opinion, but consolidated and confirmed. AMK had been warning this would go quickly. And it is. Move to Vovchansk. AMK shows Russian movement down southward and sweeping through Vovchansk itself. Most of this is east of the Donetsk River, which runs down toward Kupiansk, and this whole eastern bank is steadily tightening under Russian control. Now, the Kupiansk, Kyiv line pressure zones. Kupiansk is tricky to map precisely in street-level terms, but Suryak indicates Russian presence in the southern eastern sector along this road axis. Ukraine has done some pushback further south, but the overall arc is unfavorable for Kyiv. Keep your eye on this rail and road geometry. It's the lifeline. Slide to the Kostiantynivka front. South of it, Bakhmut-Yamkivka sectors continue to see Russian movement up the road axis. Russians appear to be engaging the outskirts rather than storming deeper before the flank is mature. That's smart, methodical pressure. Down south towards Zaporizhia. The front line is now closer to Zaporizhia city than many people want to admit. Suryak shows Julia, Sherbaki, and Zherbyanki line areas coming under Russian control. The geos yesterday were 9 kilometers behind the line. Today the maps are catching up. The gray zone should extend further west than some maps show. By my rough measure, from the current contact edge to Zaporizhia outskirts is about 66 kilometers. If you're a linear warfare bro, October 1st to now should terrify you. Anyway, legends. That's the reality as of today. Russia maintains the initiative, expands pressure zones, and holds the strategic advantage. The U.S. peace framework is not about fairness. It's about codifying what the battlefield already decided. Kyiv's remaining leverage shrinks with every month this drags on. Moscow knows it. Washington knows it. The only people pretending otherwise are the ones selling fantasies online. Look after yourselves. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.